Okay, hopefully this thing is recording, so let's go. Philosophy is this deeply self-reflective enterprise. Whenever I teach, like any class in philosophy I teach, I always have this temptation to just kind of take a step back and to ask myself, like, what the hell am I doing right now? Why are we here right now? And what are we doing right now? And there are many different and interesting answers to this question. And you know, there's an institutional answer, there's a bureaucratic answer. Max Weber could talk about traditional authority and traditional action. You know, action which is done unreflectively out of habit. And to a large extent, for you and for me, you know, this is a habitual action. Habitually, we are supposed to be here at this hour of day. But also, kind of maybe trying to go a step back, you know, it's like I've always had this temptation in the past to begin every class in philosophy that I teach, to begin it by talking about Martin Heidegger. Why not, right? And Heidegger is a special philosopher because he kind of thematizes, again, I think in a very clear fashion, suggests to us or proposes that we ask this question in a very special way, like, why am I standing here right now? In the history of Western philosophy, especially in the modern history of Western philosophy, starting with Descartes, this kind of question is supposed to lead to radical skepticism. So Descartes, this leads to radical skepticism, this radical Cartesian doubt, where Descartes imagines that he's this free-floating spirit, free-floating immaterial soul, free-floating but also free, implanted into a material body. And he imagines that he has this privileged access to himself, like as a subject, Descartes thinks that he's transparent to himself. He uniquely knows and understands what he is, and also that he is uniquely in control of his actions. So certain kind of skepticism, but also a certain kind of element of solipsism, this idea of kind of solipsism, like extreme emphasis on individuality, that the only thing that I really can know is the contents of my mind. And very importantly, this idea of immaterial soul and free will, which is important for Descartes. It causes some problems in his philosophy, and which he and others try to solve in a deeply unsatisfactory fashion, but you know, be that as it may. If this was a lecture on Descartes, we'd talk much more about this. It's a good question. Do I have a lecture on Descartes? Maybe I don't, and I should record a lecture on Descartes at some point. And there was a time in my life where I was tempted to begin every class in philosophy with Descartes and with this approach. These days, and for a very long time now, I think that kind of Heidegger has superseded Descartes. And you know, this isn't just about Heidegger. This is a certain tradition that kind of critique of Descartes, critique of Cartesian solipsism that goes back towards, well, I mean, we could talk about the Greeks or something like that. That's always complicated. Let's just stick within the modern Western tradition. So philosophers such as David Hume, or to some extent maybe Immanuel Kant, but I don't want to write Kant, and definitely Nietzsche, right? And Bertrand Russell actually thinks that there's a certain interesting road, like there's a particular path that leads directly from Hume to Nietzsche, and I tend to agree with Russell. I think that there's more in common between Hume and Nietzsche than people usually understand. That's not to say that Nietzsche was influenced by Hume. I don't think that Nietzsche read Hume. Maybe he never read Hume at all, I would imagine. Nietzsche didn't like reading philosophy in general, but certainly particular insights of Nietzsche, of Humean philosophy, just permeated the general understanding of what philosophy is about. And so, okay, so this is all very abstract. Let me go back. So, I mean, I want to focus on something very, very specific. So Descartes is this philosophy of free will. If you want, this is the teleological approach from the Greek word telos, which means aim or purpose or goal, that there are purposes in nature, and in an important privileged sense, you and me have purposes. Whereas Heidegger, to some extent following Hume and Nietzsche, Heidegger wants to say that our primordial experience is not this experience of free, rational agents in the world of material objects, but our experience is of finding myself. Again, the German word for this is Befindlichkeit. We find ourselves always already thrown into this world. So we find ourselves ourselves thrown into this world without a manual. And very importantly, again, there are different ways to I don't know, proceed from here. If this was a lecture on Heidegger, I'd talk much more about the technical details of his approach. But for our purposes, I want to kind of emphasize the common ground between Heidegger, Hume, and Nietzsche with this idea that what we find ourselves with are beliefs, values, and desires. Beliefs, values, and desires. And like for Heidegger, yes, we are thrown into this world. We're thrown without a manual, and we are anxious and kind of groundless. Our being is groundless. And when Heidegger says that we're anxious and groundless, this should be understood, I think, like in a Freudian sense. That most of the time, and this is where I think Freud and Heidegger would agree, and I think that there's a lot of interesting parallels. Like most of the time, we run away into busyness. We try to block our mind from perceiving this fundamental groundlessness and anxiety which is there. So groundlessness and anxiety, which exists there all the time. But we try to block it out. We try to not think about it. We try to kind of fill our minds with just useless clutter, right? But then, I'm trying to say two things at the same time. Let me finish with beliefs, values, and desires, then I'll talk about this clutter and anxiety, right? So, and the idea is that you don't choose your beliefs, values, and desires. You find yourself already with them. And in fact, Heidegger would probably not like me talking about this because beliefs, values, and desires, this sounds very, like, very cognitive, very clear-cut, like too clear-cut. Because for Heidegger, in an important sense, these are like subconscious, preconscious, maybe unconscious dispositions. And they are not easily categorizable. They are not easily formalizable or verbalizable, right? So kind of these things, like we're not really talking about beliefs, but we're talking about a basic disposition, like how do you understand the world. We're not necessarily talking about specific values, like I value human life or I value academic freedom. But again, certain like preconscious, vague predisposition towards kind of judgmentalism, judgmental actions. Paul Bloom, psychologist from Yale, talks about how you can ask people to judge, and they will judge anything. You can ask people to pass moral judgments on let's say, on a freezer or on a refrigerator, and people can easily do that. Like we do this all the time. Well, kind of we're judgmental in this sense. And likewise, desires. Sometimes desires can be, I mean, the word desire kind of presupposes that we know what the object of desire is, and it's very clear and understandable. Whereas, again, I think for Heidegger, again, in this Freudian fashion, we're not looking for specific desires, but we're talking about this kind of drivenness of human psyche. And very often what happens to make this kind of more concrete is that people say they want something, but actually this is not what they want. They mistakenly think they want it. And once they get it, they don't get any satisfaction. Lacan, who in important respects is a synthesis of Heidegger and Freud, talks about this objet petit a, this metonymic sliding of desire from object to object to object, but the desire is never satisfied because it's more fundamental than the verbal kind of shell into which we can put it, right? And so once you see it this way, you stop seeing human beings as immortal souls and as having free wills. But again, in this kind of mechanistic fashion, and again, for me, this is the most important transition in the history of mankind. This is the most important intellectual transition in the history of mankind, from the teleological to the mechanistic worldview. And Heidegger, I mean, I'm oversimplifying, and it's like this is a very tendentious presentation because, of course, once I put it this way, is Heidegger really a mechanistic philosopher? People are going to argue, but I want to say Heidegger is uniquely suited to fit in with the mechanistic project. Like as a mechanistic philosopher, I'm happy to bring Heidegger on board, even if Heidegger himself might not have been on board with this entire picture, which may or may not be true. It's complicated. Philosophers are always complicated, right? And so suddenly you realize that human beings don't free will and human beings don't have souls. And what we are is we are products of larger forces. And today we would say, and I think this is very important, you're not exactly supposed to say this like in a philosophy class, because this immediately people will say this sounds controversial, right? But let me be controversial. Human beings are products of larger forces. so larger forces. And these forces like a dual nature of biological and cultural evolution. And by the way, as far as we can tell from things like from disciplines such as evolutionary psychology, biological evolution and cultural evolution, they go hand in hand. It's a co-evolution, like it's two sides of the same process. And the idea is that, if you understand Darwin, and that's the very kind of strange nature of our education, because surely Darwinian revolution is one of the most important events in the intellectual history of the world, and very few people understand that. Like, that's not what we by and large focus on in schools. And even people who try to teach Darwin, usually, maybe Darwin himself even did not understand the full implication of his philosophy. So, but I like to talk about this kind of long scientific revolution from Thales through, I could write Copernicus. Galileo, okay. Thales, Galileo, Newton. So let's say Thales, Galileo, Newton, Darwin, and you could talk about Einstein, I guess. I'm not sure. But very importantly, since we're trying to understand human beings, we need to talk about. I would say, on the one hand, you have people like Nietzsche, Freud, and Marx, and on the other hand, you have Alan Turing. And from Nietzsche, Freud, and Marx, maybe you get Michel Foucault. And kind of my whole approach is that there's a unique, interesting mode of interaction between Foucault and Turing, because both are going to emphasize this way of looking at human beings as mechanisms. Turing, computation, strong AI. Turing, there is no interesting difference between a human brain and a computer. And Foucault, continuing on from Hume, Nietzsche, and Heidegger, is gonna, broadly speaking, arrive at a similar conclusion. That, I don't have a soul, you don't have a soul. We are products of these larger forces. And it's like I'm immediately tempted. I need to throw this on the board somewhere, because two figures who are really important for me and are becoming more and more important day by day are Socrates and Buddha. And I want to say that Socrates and Buddha are both, in an important sense, on board with this project, or are like useful contributors to this project. Because Socrates, if you talk about this groundlessness and anxiety, this is what he uncovers. He goes around the streets of Athens and he asks people who are supposed to be experts in their field, who are supposed to be respected people, generals, like army generals, or brilliant politicians, or leading aristocrats, and he asks them basic questions like, what is justice, or what is piety, meaning what do gods want from human beings? How do you define words such as good, and how do you define words such as good with respect to what gods want, right? And Socrates finds out that people cannot give him an answer. And so kind of we have this, Rousseau will talk about this amour de soi and amour propre. Amour de soi, kind of your existence within yourself, but then amour propre, this way you present yourself to others. And kind of in this false and facetious way of presenting ourselves to others, yes, all of these wonderful generals and poets have a certain story that they tell, and Foucault would say it's not they who speak a language, but language speaks through them, and they say certain words as if they're magical words. But once Socrates, Socrates asks, "What is justice?" and everybody has some kind of response. Polemarchus is an army officer, and Polemarchus, of course, has some response as to what justice is, helping your friends and harming your enemies. And then Socrates probes him a little bit more and asks, "How do you know who are your friends and who are your enemies?" And try to define that, try to understand that, and immediately Polemarchus runs into a wall. And notice, this isn't because, much of philosophy, I think, unfortunately, much of philosophy, even which goes in academia, is a waste of time, just, word salad, like playing with words without achieving anything significant. But this is not a conceptual trick. This is not a simple, this is not an arbitrary question to ask, who are your friends and who are your enemies? Because when Socrates asks Polemarchus this question, this is not necessarily very explicit in the dialogue, so I'm doing a bit of my own interpretation. But you ask an army officer, during the 30 Years' War, during the Peloponnesian War, you ask the army officer, who are your friends and who are your enemies? You are an Athenian officer. Who among the Athenians are your friends? And who are enemies? Who are traitors? Who secretly want Athens to win? among the allies of Athens, who are friends and who are enemies? That's a very difficult question. That's a very difficult and very uneasy question. You know, are members of your family your friends necessarily? Again, Thucydides, and we are supposed to read Thucydides and talk about Thucydides in this class a little bit. Thucydides talks, and this is one of the most horrifying experiences that human beings can go through in their lives, probably as bad as human experiences go. He talks about civil war in Corcyra. So, he basically talks about how members of a single family, Thucydides discusses this, members of a single family go to war against one another, torture and kill each other, members of families. It's like, again, the suffering and destruction of human life, which is kind of at the verge of what is humanly possible. Like life during a civil war, as bad as life in general gets for human beings. You know, any kind of torture, any kind of suffering, I don't know, children dying from hunger. Yeah, you have that. That's civil war in Corcyra, which was a part of the larger conflict of the Peloponnesian War, right? And sort of, this is a little bit chaotic, but let me try to bring this somehow back on point, right? So our course is philosophy. Well, it's called whatever, international political thought, but broadly speaking, philosophy, right? And philosophy, since the beginning of human culture, probably, was always used, or could always be used, or was always complicit in maintaining and justifying the status quo. And this is kind of this radical approach, you know, in somebody like Socrates and Buddha, anticipating. So, like, again, recently I like to talk about Socrates, Rousseau, and Foucault. So one particular line of reasoning, from Socrates to Jean-Jacques Rousseau to Michel Foucault. So what am I talking about? I'm talking about social criticism. These are philosophers who are deeply critical about society and who are saying societies are going to hell, and the biggest problem with society is the problem that we think that we know how to define the word good. We think that we know how to define this word in terms of maybe beliefs, values, and desires. We think we understand that, and basically the suspicion is that the ruling class, and when I say the ruling class, we have to remember larger force of biological and cultural evolution. This is a structuralist picture. So it's not like the ruling class or conspiracy theory, they create a certain kind of ideology. No. It is a structural, and I mean, you know, we need to look at the details of the way particular philosophers will describe this. You know, Marx has a certain vision of human history, right? You know, it's like in Jerry Cohen's interpretation, which I agree with, right? You have a certain kind of, you know, selection mechanism for ideologies, right? Like if you're a feudal lord or if you're a slave owner, psychologically you're motivated to tell a certain story about how slavery is actually justified. And by the way, I should also add this to the board somewhere. I understand that I'm talking about everything at the same time. And this is kind of, in an important sense, this is kind of not a full map of my head, but this is a map of a large chunk of my brain, a large chunk of my thinking, because all of this fits together, even if I'm not necessarily always able to show you the links. And this is incidentally one of the reasons why I keep teaching, because, you know, every next time I give this kind of a talk, it's hopefully getting more and more coherent, more and more relevant to reality. But sort of, again, let me just finish. So yeah, let's stick with this. So we're talking about a structural approach, and so Marx is going to say that there's an economic base, and then there's the ideological superstructure. But then the ideological superstructure as a system of ideas, so this is a system of economic relations, this is a system of ideas, it has to attach somehow, it has to interface with the individual psychology, right? So kind of you need to have these micro foundations, and actually like all of them are connected to each other. This is an interconnected system, right? So I could talk about this for a long time. Sorry, we could talk about this as well. The usual example I give to illustrate this is tea and silk in China. Yeah, should I give this example? Yeah. So it's kind of a different way of looking at society, right? So as a matter of individual psychology, you know, human beings like tea and silk. Why? Well, after Darwin, we're supposed to tell some kind of an evolutionary story. And get this, the economic forces, the economic structure, the technology is developed to such an extent that it's more profitable, this is a complicated word, but still, it's more profitable, it's more efficient to grow tea and silk and then exchange it for rice. Because if you think of China, I mean, what does China try to do? China needs peasants and soldiers. And peasants grow rice, and rice feeds soldiers. So at the end of the day, you could say, like, under a certain prism, under a certain realist prism, the only thing you need is a loyal army. And to have a loyal army, you need to be able to pay them with rice. So just grow rice. Don't grow tea and silk, right? But the idea is that, you know, if you kind of tea and silk are like mechanisms that you can use to control individual psychology. It's like little head crabs that you can attach to the heads of human individuals and make them motivated to behave in a particular fashion. So, you know, it's like the easiest example I could give, which is a remote example. It's not identical in any shape, matter, or form. Well, no, it is similar, but it's very different also. Opium. Imagine somebody's an addict and they work for opium. So actually, you could justify growing not just rice, but also growing a certain amount of opium, because not just feeding people with rice, but also having them hooked up on a drug, opium. And there is a psychological mechanism. There's an electrochemical mechanism as to why opium makes you addicted, right? And you can use this addiction to make rice production more efficient and to try to see tea and silk in a similar fashion, right? And kind of at the end of the day, it's not a question of ruling class versus peasants, although Marx does talk about this. This is kind of intermediary explanatory categories, because at the end of the day, what we're talking about is we're talking about the systems of efficiency for the sake of efficiency. You have like this constellation of which you can call the Chinese state that fights against kind of nomadic incursions, and the Chinese state will either withstand those incursions or will be conquered or maybe will be destroyed. And again, so this is a kind of quasi-Darwinian picture of natural selection or maybe cultural selection. Think about this: most languages that have existed throughout the history of the world are extinct. Most cultures that have existed throughout the world are extinct. Most religions that have existed throughout the world are extinct. There are these deep structural pressures, right? And so kind of it's important, kind of, this is not trying to play the blame game. This is also a big misunderstanding of Marx, I think. It's not trying to play the blame game, it's trying to understand what society is. However, yes, we do understand, but in the process of understanding, we unmask the existing order as arbitrary. That we unmask the status quo as potentially quite deleterious, because you find yourself, and this is why, again, like this, so problematic point, and there's no, I don't want to go into details right now, but of course, I mean, I am bourgeois, you are bourgeois, so I'm a bourgeois, teacher teaching bourgeois students. We have a certain way of looking at this system, right? For you and me, we don't have to worry about dying from hunger. We don't have to worry about going broke, not being able to pay the rent next month, right? Our problem is that the system, the way it exists now, is trying to take advantage of us. And I mean, I have no idea what your future will look like, but many of my own classmates, people I graduated with, and many of the students that I know who graduated under my supervision, right? I see their lives being really bad because, like this global imperialist capitalism takes advantage of them. Kind of go back to this phrase that capitalism is war against humanity. That kind of, and Heidegger likes to talk about this, the technological understanding of being, that humanity dominates nature, but also kind of this understanding of being, Foucault would call this discourse. Marx could call this ideology, kind of a certain way of arranging society. That, capitalism, whatever we mean by this word, oppresses humanity. It's not that human beings oppress each other. Capitalism oppresses everybody. Like, everybody's alienated, everybody's depressed, everybody's oppressed, including the bourgeoisie. They in a different position vis-a-vis the system, but that's kind of the ultimate point of Marx's doctrine. That's the hope, the promise of Marxism, and in general of the project of enlightenment, that you can have a different society which is going to be based on common interest, right? And kind of the idea that the socialist revolution is not the revenge of the poor against the rich, but an evolution to a higher stage of society in which everybody will be better off. And kind of this idea, how Marx talks about how in communism there is no interesting difference between altruism and egoism. Of course, it's a beautiful picture, but is it true? Is it viable? Is it plausible? Is it feasible? That's a separate discussion. let me take a step back. So I was talking about the social criticism from Socrates to Buddha. Again, this idea that philosophy needs to be like a martial art, an art of self-defense. Socrates says in Plato's dialogue Alcibiades, he actually talks to Alcibiades, saying that the first task of education is to unlearn all of the harmful and deleterious things that society has implanted into us. Socrates, again, has these private conversations to private individuals because, in I think, a good interpretation of what he's doing, he believes that his society is so broken, so wrong, that it's impossible to talk to people at large, urbi et orbi. The only way he can talk to people is to take private individuals, and in a long and careful conversation with them, maybe you can move in a certain particular direction. Also notice that there's a very important collegial aspect to what Socrates is doing. Because if you don't talk to other people, you always run the risk of getting kind of lost inside of your own head, getting lost inside of your own ideas, like believing the kind of narrative that you tell to yourself. Kind of for Socrates, this is a very important kind of aspect of togetherness. Gemeinschaft, I could even say, right? This idea that for me, to help myself, I need to help you, because only together, kind of critically examining the thoughts of each other in this productive dialogue, can we move ahead. And this is why, again, kind of for Socrates, this is this ideal of the dialogue, of the free and equal discussion. So, somewhere, free and equal discussion. And this is why I oppose calling people professors, especially in social sciences inside the university, because this is not supposed to be about professorship, about hierarchy, and about discipline and indoctrination. This is supposed to be about free and equal discussion. And I have to treat you as colleagues, because if I don't, I run the risk of kind of believing my own narrative, and that's kind of losing access to reality, losing this possibility to verify and double check and progress. I mean, Socrates, that's one of the important starting points of his philosophy. I know that I know nothing. This admission or understanding of the radically limited nature of human mind. We have to talk to each other, because no human being is a prophet from God. No human being can guarantee to themselves that they know the truth. Thomas Hobbes will always say, yeah, there are some people who think that they're prophets from God, but how do they know that they are really prophets from God and not, let's say, mad or liars, right? So Socrates, Buddha, Socrates, Rousseau, Foucault, and okay, so another three names just for fun. Buddha, Nietzsche. So Buddha. Well, no. Let's just write Nietzsche, Marx, Foucault. Yeah, that's another way to phrase this kind of critical aspect, kind of in support of this free and equal discussion. Now, kind of. Calling into the question the notion of what do we mean by the word good, that's a problem, and this is a fundamental problem for this entire project. Nietzsche asks, what are the value of values, right? So much of our lives are kind of unconscious. We just inherit from our biology and from our society the notion that certain things are just wrong and you're not supposed to do them. And the question is why? Like, again, I've had this wonderful experience of being a school child in Russia, and you have this kind of quasi-Kantian deontological notion. Children are supposed to learn. That's what they're supposed to do. You're supposed to go to school. Why? Don't ask questions. That's a sinful question to ask. It is the task of the child. It is what belongs to the children to learn. This is their kind of I don't know. I'm looking. Well, you understand, like it's what you're supposed to do, deontologically. Don't ask about consequences. Don't ask about why. Don't ask about what conditions what consequences this is going to bring. Like this is a value. This is an unconditional value. Incidentally, why again I think both Locke and Kant, and especially Immanuel Kant, I see as opponents, as somebody I fight against. So I have Descartes here. I could also add maybe Kant here, kind of fighting against Kant and Kantian way of looking at the world. No, let's ask the question as to why. And again, for me, there's a very clear understanding that so much of my education when I was a child was really bad, deleterious for me, was really bad, was a waste of time, and was actually damaging to my psychology and damaging to my cognitive abilities. Again, this is partially because schools in Russia in the 90s were not very good, but partially there is this kind of a broader approach. And again, we discussed this last time, that Socrates was executed basically on the charges of treason, and there is this treasonous element to philosophy, always kind of calling into question the status quo, right? kind of one other thing that I want to mention is that kind of what is the roadmap? Where do we go from here to there? Well, and I want to say two things, and I have to try to say this as quickly as I can, and as quickly as I can, and I don't know, as concisely as I can, as clearly as I can. So when we talk about values, we can talk about immanent values and transcendent values. And then, kind of, this is going to be my point number one. And my point number two is going to be that justice is simply common interest. So let's start maybe with this kind of values. This is interest. Well, actually, like this. Values can be immanent or transcendent. And when we talk about immanent values, this can only be defined as subjective interest, right? So, what am I talking about? I'm talking about how if I ask you what is good, and you tell me, well, I have this holy book which tells me what is good, that, I don't know, you need to sacrifice sacred virgins on full moon, and this is what God wants. That's a transcendent standard of value. Like, this goes back to Socrates, to the Euthyphro problem. Whatever gods tell you is good. Whatever gods tell you is good. You know, torture children, eat children. If gods tell you to do that, that's good, right? And Socrates in this dialogue, Euthyphro, calls this position into question. And again, for basic skeptical reasons, and again, Hobbes talks about this quite explicitly, transcendent criterion cannot work because you can never verify. We don't have a cut line to God or to gods. That's why this transcendent criterion is goes out the window. So the only thing that we have left is immanent criterion. And it's very interesting because in Socrates and in Buddha and in one philosopher who's very dear to my heart, Epicurus, you have this immanent criterion. That we have an intrinsic, internal standard of what is health and what is happiness, subjectively, right? And this is a problem, and this is kind of a discussion, because and basically this is utilitarianism, and I'm very happy to call myself a utilitarian, and I think it's important to fight for utilitarianism, and I feel that there's a lot of pushback for the wrong reasons. Utilitarianism is criticized for the wrong reasons, because ultimately at the end of the day, I think that's the only game in town. Now, somebody like Foucault, and it's always very important to think about Foucault, would say, well, it's possible for people to believe that they are healthy and to believe that they are happy, and yet be utterly miserable and sick. And that's a problem, because the answer is yes, it's possible to be mistaken. But how do you know? How do you know? Like, let me imagine this kind of statement. I thought that I was healthy, but turns out I was wrong. I was actually sick. Like, is that possible? And first of all, I think yes, it's quite possible. Like because you see human consciousness, like we have a limited attention span. Your attention is fixated on something else, and then suddenly you realize, oh, I have a horrible headache right now. This could happen. Like right now, I'm talking to you, I'm focused on the words that I'm saying, and incidentally, I have an elevated heart rate. I did not notice that. I did not pay attention to that. Like, human attention is limited. So it's possible to be wrong. And by the way, go back to this idea of Sprachlichkeit, language, I mentioned with respect to Rousseau, but also with respect to Socrates, this idea that human beings don't just exist, but they also describe their existence in a certain way. Athenian statesmen give Socrates a certain answer, and this is kind of a narrative. Language speaks through them. So this kind of doubling of existence. We don't just exist, but we also describe our existence. Sprachlichkeit, in language. And language is not a neutral medium, right? And you can think of Freud in terms of, let's say, id and superego. You can talk about, let's say, maybe Nietzsche in terms of the master morality and slave morality. Kind of this doubling of existence. Don't just exist, but also describe your existence. Or Marx, when he talks about ideology, certainly it's something that plays out on this level of description. How you are actually horribly miserable and unhappy, but you lie to yourself. You misdescribe your experiences. Actually, no, I'm the happiest person ever. It's a distinct possibility of human life. We could discuss this in detail if you want, but I think it's true, quite true, right? But once if you throw transcendent criterion out the window, the only thing you're left with is immanent criterion. Taking your bearing from health and happiness, somehow defined, which is not easy to define. It's difficult to know how to become happy and healthy, and to know what health and happiness is. And here, let me maybe add this to the board. Like you need to do two things. You need to train your attention, and you need to engage in critique. So attention plus critique. Let me write this somewhere. Attention plus critique. So attention is learning to do this. Which is a very difficult thing to do. But to learn, and I'm not an expert on it, yeah? But to learn to pay attention to what goes on inside. Like, let me give you, I'm sorry, I understand I digress, but sometimes it's good to give examples. Like, when I started doing yoga, I realized that I had chronic pain in my shoulder, this shoulder, right here. And the pain was always there, I just didn't notice it. Right? So it takes effort, a certain kind of focus to refocus your brain, refocus your mind, and to start noticing, right? So you need attention. And then also, second, you need critique. Because very often people are going to say, like, this is the way things have to be done. It's kind of like not taking a step back and asking, like, I don't know, like imagine you're driving down the road, right? And somebody else cuts right in front of you. And you get very angry, you get very mad, and you want to punish them. You want to take vengeance upon them, right? And critique would ask you, like, why? Why do you have this feeling? Did you choose, did your free immortal soul choose this feeling for you? Or is this some sort of, you know, I mean, I can tell you a quasi-Darwinian evolution psychological story. Altruistic punishment. That yes, what you're going to do is at great risk to yourself, you're going to sacrifice your well-being, you're going to sacrifice your calmness, and try to take revenge, which is probably going to be counterproductive, right? And there's an evolutionary story as to how kind of our genes in the past evolved in such a way as to pre-program this kind of behavior. And once you realize that, like paying attention, realizing, oh, I'm super angry right now. And secondly, wow, I'm super angry actually for a bad reason. I'm super angry because kind of in the past there was this mechanism that led to me having a certain, you know, attitude towards myself and towards life, and it's like, and I should distance myself from it. I should not embrace my rage. Let me give you another example. I'm using simplistic examples because, you know, all of this is complicated. I mean, we could talk about, see, who knows? I'm recording this. Who knows when people are going to look at this recording? Maybe there will be a war going on. There are wars going on every day, and have been for the past many years, and will probably continue into the future. War is a normal state of affairs from the standpoint of you know, global neoliberal capitalism. You know, it's an interesting thought experiment, just an interesting, you know, well. Yeah, let's just call it a thought experiment. When I or you or somebody else will be listening to this, you know, a year from now or 5 years from now, ask yourself, where is a war going on right now? Where are there human rights violations right now? When there's police or military shooting innocent civilians or children dying from hunger? Where? Because I mean, it's an unfortunate prediction. It's a very tragic prediction, but this is going to continue. Next year, in 2 years, in 10 years, very likely there will be a place on the globe when this thing is happening. Because, you know, I think there's good reason to believe that violence and this kind of war, war between states, but also war within the states, war of the government against its own population, is endemic to the way neoliberal capitalism works. Let me go back a step. Yeah, so attention and critique. Let me give you another example. Sugar. It's the simplest example in the book. First of all, be attentive. Kind of it's, diet is a problematic topic. Diet is very difficult, and most people who try to go on diet end up gaining weight, not losing weight. It shows you all sorts of ways in which the Cartesian picture is limited. It's not that we're souls, we have free will. No, in this Heideggerian, Freudian fashion, human psyche is a complicated hydraulic system. And when you try to change something about your life, like your eating habits, all sorts of other things begin to go wrong in your psychology, because psychology is interconnected in these intricate and complicated ways. Right? But kind of, you know, one of the things that people do, mindful people do, you know, Buddhists are supposed to do, or people who do yoga are supposed to do, supposed to notice, pay attention to what food does to you. And very often, like part of, you know, one way in which you quit eating junk food, one way in which you quit eating junk food is just by paying attention and noticing, kind of realizing that this is kind of, I don't know, food which takes advantage of you. Like it's an uncomfortable experience if you pay close attention to it. But then, in terms of critique, I can give you a story, a much easier, like road rage is difficult to explain and will take some time. But sugar I can explain in a second, right? I hope, right? So in the evolutionary past, in autumn, you have fruit, you have to eat as much as possible and become as fat as possible so that you can survive through winter. So many animals, especially mammals, especially human beings, are hardwired to absolutely love sweet things, and not just love them, but our insulin system works in such a way that sugar is very easily absorbed and turns into fat in our bodies. In evolutionary past, that was good and helped us survive through winter. And today, it's bad, and people become obese and diabetic and die from all sorts of problems, including cancer, because obesity, among other things, leads to cancer, right? And all sorts of problems. But this kind of attention and critique. And so, and notice, like it's important for people to be in dialogue with one another, because you cannot necessarily guarantee what's right and what's wrong, and we cannot necessarily know why do we do the things we do. Right? And individuals by themselves are too weak to disentangle themselves from this mess. We're in this together. I should be wrapping up, and I will wrap up. So this is values, and this is, by the way, I think this is uncontroversial, but it's actually super controversial. When we begin talking about values, so many students I have are completely unsympathetic, unreceptive to me talking about values, because this is difficult, this is close to heart, and this hurts to re-examine our values. This is a very, very, very painful process. But once we have done this, I feel that, again, my position, in line with the ancient sophists, I think in line with Plato and with Socrates, is that the word justice, the meaning of the word justice is unavailable to us. There's no such thing as justice from the capital J. Not because I can prove that it doesn't exist, but it's a basic skeptical argument. We don't have a hotline to God. So the only reasonable sense that we can attach to the word justice is simply common interest, which is defined here, subjectively. And that's a project. It's a critical project. Project of social critique, radical critique, but it's also a project of reform and transformation, project of enlightenment, and people like Marx or Jürgen Habermas or Antonio Gramsci play into this project. And I guess talking about this great project of transformation, of social engineering and creating a society in which the interests of the individual and the interests of society are reconciled, this building utopia, right? To just make a comment about this project is that this probably, judging by past history, this probably will take a lot of time. Young Marx was super optimistic. He thought that communism is going to come in 1848. And starting with 1848, we're going to be able to move forward. By the way, Marxism, economic foundation, I feel that this is actually, in this entire system, this is why I'm happy to call myself a Marxist. I do think that economic transformation has to lead the way. That people will be able to be attentive and critical if you give them the economic resources to do so. Most people are not attentive, not critical, do not understand what is happiness, and do not understand what is good, because they work too much and they have no time to think about this stuff, and they do not have the sufficient education. But if you give people resources, they will educate themselves. But if people don't have resources, good education is meaningless because nobody can get it. I mean, people in this country, for example, are deeply uneducated, in the vast majority of them, and because the working people, and they have no time to think, or most people on planet Earth, right? Anyway, it's a long discussion, but there you have it. But the problem is that how do you get from here to there? We live in an imperfect world. How do we get to this, world which is hopefully a much better place, right? And here, I should be wrapping up. I understand. I'm trying as fast as possible. So you have the Marxist tradition, and then you have the realist tradition, and I think that there's an interesting parallel between them, because if you simply throw money at, let's say, we talk about this Wallerstein, yeah? Countries of the core, first world countries of the core, third world countries of the periphery. If the first world countries of the first world countries of the West simply throw money at the poor countries of the third world, of the periphery, how can you guarantee that they will be on board with this project and not, I'm oversimplifying, I'm saying something offensive, but it's an oversimplification, a caricature, right? How can you guarantee that the poorer countries will not simply build nuclear weapons and, blackmail the countries of the core? And I'm attentive to that, right? So again, let me go back a step. Marx was very optimistic. He thought that in 1848, we're going to have this transition. But it turns out it's 1848. But it turns out it's a much more problematic process. And so instead of this easy transition, Bob's your uncle, we're in communism tomorrow. Instead, what we have is this kind of, I want to say, my brand of Marxism is this Weberian, Gramscian Marxism. Weber has this beautiful phrase. He talks about this, starkes langsames Bohren von harten Brettern, that politics is slow, tedious boring of hard boards. Like change is gradual, and kind of this idea of building up gradually, bit by bit, institutions of civil society. So I talk about Weber and Gramsci. I could equally talk about Habermas and Bourdieu, who are very important philosophers for me as well. Habermas and Bourdieu. And this idea of building slowly and gradually, step by step, institutions of civil society. And this, especially for Gramsci, and for Wallerstein, and for Marx, this has to begin in the countries of the core. It should be the working class of Israel that helps the working class of Palestine to unionize. It should be the working class of America that helps the working class of Syria or Iraq to unionize. And this is not happening. Instead, we have this war of all against all, resurgence of nationalism, and kind of in the name of national interest, instead of unionizing across state lines, you have right-wing populist movements erecting barriers and building walls and placing checkpoints and placing entry permits and visas. So this is an optimistic project. It's a very optimistic project, but is it realistic? Is it going to happen anytime soon? And so, like, Marxists are maybe optimistic about the future, but for the present, I feel that Marxist and realist analysis has to be almost identical, very close. And so, Gramsci has this wonderful phrase, pessimismo dell'intelligenza, ottimismo della volontà. So we're optimistic about the future. Our will is optimistic, but our intellect is pessimistic because we can tell a story as to why this doesn't seem to be happening very fast. And who knows? Maybe communism or this kind of enlightened society is maybe even impossible. No, I mean, kind of, again, within this mechanistic worldview, the universe is governed by the second law of thermodynamics. Entropy increases, disorder increases. Der Schlund des zwecklosen Chaos der Materie. The universe is the abyss of the purposeless chaos of matter. This is not necessarily a story that moves somewhere with a happy ending. There are no guarantees. This is not like a biblical story of the second coming of Jesus, right? This doesn't necessarily have a happy ending. And in this sense, realism and Marxism, I think, are anti-teleological in this sense as well. There are no intrinsic values and purposes in nature, and there is no necessary happy end to human history. There is no necessary goal towards which this is moving. And so, to go back a step, so we talk about Socrates, Buddha, Socrates and Buddha, and then I have, okay, let me try. So Socrates and Buddha, okay, no, I mean, let me leave it like that. Socrates, Buddha, Socrates, Rousseau, Foucault, and then Nietzsche, Marx, and Freud. Like all of them, I feel, are pessimistic, maybe with the exception of Marx. But later Marx, he stops, apparently, as far as I can tell, he stops writing about communism because communism doesn't come in 1848, and he becomes disillusioned. And so what you have is this deep question, and Rousseau asked this question very explicitly: what do you do if society goes to hell around you? And Socrates asked this question very explicitly, and I think Foucault does as